Good afternoon, folks. I'm Emily Bertrand, the Director of Product Marketing here at Axero, specifically on our mid-market business. Thanks for joining us today to hear from our expert panel on thinking about the adversary offensive and defensive strategies. Before we get into the meat of it, let's quickly run through what the next hour or so will look like. In a minute, I'll introduce you to our expert speakers who you'll be hearing discuss this topic at length with a specific focus on the threat actor Darkseid. We'll then get into a brief background on the topic and cover our attack perspectives before getting into our panel discussion. We'll follow that up by sharing some additional resources that might be of use to you as you explore this further in your organization. And then we'll wrap it up with any questions from the audience. That said, if you do have any questions along the way, feel free to submit them as we go in the questions tab on the right-hand side. We'll make sure we get to those at the end. With that said, let me introduce you to our first speaker, Shawn Hiddle, a distinguished security engineer here at Axero. Shawn is passionate about getting into the mindset of the attacker when designing defense strategies. While working at Netscope and Symantec, Shawn has reverse engineered every major ransomware strain from 2006 to 2018, noting that effective mechanisms used to evade defenses and has helped guide defense improvements along the way. Shawn loves to anticipate where the attacker will go next and enjoys to identify choke points in their architecture. This work culminated in a patent in the area of detection of ransomware based on file encryption operations and the automatic recovery of these damaged files. As Shawn has said, if ransomware can encrypt, it is rendered useless. Next up is our second panelist, Adam Mansour, former CTO of Intelligo Networks and current head of sales engineering here at Axero. A thought leader in cyber technology, Adam has the depth of knowledge of an industry veteran with over 15 years experience in the cybersecurity sector. As head of sales engineering here, Adam is driving the company's vCISO and tech integration programs and its evolution as the industry's leading managed detection and response service provider. Adam's experience is both broad and deep within the sector and spans endpoint, network, and cloud system security, audits and architecture, building and managing stocks, software development, and resellership alike. So basically everything in between. Most recently, he served as vCISO, helping our customers through new privacy regulations like GDPR, CCPA, and Bill C11, as well as providing guidance on how to prevent complex malware such as SolarGate and ransomware as a service like our threat actor of today, Darkseid. Before we get in and hear from the experts, let's dive into a little background for context on why we thought this would be a valuable discussion for you today. For decades, ransomware around the globe have grown in sophistication. As bad actors have reaped the profits of these crimes, they have grown more organized and competitive, operating in some ways like legitimate businesses or criminal enterprises offering a service. At the same time, they've also become more extortionate in their threats and demands to their victims. Ransomware results in the highest material impact to organizations, especially to smaller ones like municipal governments and small to mid-sized businesses like yours. These organizations face the same threats as these larger enterprises, but often without the people, processes, and tech to defend against these sophisticated attackers. And these types of attacks are only growing in both sophistication and reach. According to Gartner, 27% of all malware incidents experienced in 2020 can be attributed to ransomware. That's especially concerning proportion when you consider the average ransomware payment in just the second quarter of 2020 was over $178,000. Another telling point to note is that the median attacker dwell time before detection was 11 days. So to put this in context, 11 days potentially provides attackers with 264 hours of malicious activity, such as lateral movement, credential dumping, data exfiltration, and more. Considering that some of these activities can just take a couple minutes or a few hours to implement, often taking place at night or outside of your standard working hours, 11 days offers attackers plenty of time to cause damage in an organization's network. It's also worth noting that ransomware attacks tend to have a shorter dwell time than stealth attacks because they're all about destruction. And I'm sure everyone has read about a new company or a public sector organization being attacked by ransomware, and also probably noticed how much more frequently this is happening now. Most recently, you've likely heard about the repercussions from the ransomware incident that forced Colonial Pipeline, the company responsible for nearly half the fuel supply in the US East Coast, to proactively shut down their operations. Stores of gasoline, diesel, home heating, jet fuel, military supplies were so heavily affected that the FMCSA declared a state of emergency in 18 states to help with these shortages. Shortly after that, the FBI did confirm that Darkseid, a cyber criminal believed to have originated in Eastern Europe, is behind the attack. And given the relevance of this attacker in particular, we wanted to focus our conversation around thinking about the adversary on Darkseid specifically. With that, we thought it would be beneficial to turn to two experts on the topic. Shawn is going to be wearing a red shirt today, and we'll be focused on answering the broad question of how the adversary is thinking about infiltrating your organization. On the opposite side, we have Adam, who will be wearing a blue shirt today. Adam will be speaking to how organizations can proactively defend themselves against the adversary. Shawn, I'm going to hand it over to you to get started. Given we're going to focus on Darkseid today, can we start with some context? Who are they? What's their manifesto?
Absolutely. Thanks for the introduction, Emily. So perfect timing here with all the developments that have been happening with the Department of Justice and other agencies publicizing some of the ways that they've managed to tackle Darkseid being in the news this morning and yesterday and so on. Before we can really talk about Darkseid, though, we need to clarify a few terms that are key to their operation. Darkseid is at the forefront of several of these innovations. Darkseid is a long cycle, double extortion ransomware as a service vendor. So what that means is that Darkseid is not the group that will typically break into a place like Colonial Pipeline. I mean, I don't know the attribution with Colonial Pipeline itself, of course, but Darkseid prefers to be the creator of the infrastructure that's required rather than the ones that do the attacks itself. They'll be responsible for selling all that infrastructure to anybody that knows how to break into a given company, and then they just run an affiliate program to make sure that they get their cut and they sell the infrastructure so that the people that want to do the direct dirty work are completely disassociated from each other. Darkseid is a long cycle attack infrastructure. What that means is we talked about 11 days being the average before, but Darkseid users will typically be inside of the victim's environment, reconnoitering it thoroughly for sometimes days, but this can be weeks and months in some of the cases we've seen. During this time, they're doing everything they can to find all of the crown jewels, all of the user accounts, all of the source code repositories, any legal proceedings, personal interaction of employees, anything at all that they think would be juicy to entice that second ransom. So the entirety of their goal is to be a double extortion provider, meaning that the users of Darkseid will demand one ransom for decryption of the files, but a second ransom and probably a subscription ransom at that to make sure that the files that they've stolen in the process aren't leaked. So Darkseid operates what they call a sustainable storage system, which is servers in places like Iran and other countries that are more difficult to actually shut down directly, where they'll store copies of all the files. And of course, everything's distributed. So one server goes down, there's another copy of all the stolen files somewhere else. Some of these sensitive files that we've seen have included things like client data, financial data, employee passports, in some cases, very personal information at that point, contracts, legal proceedings.
So it sounds like they're doing a lot for one, but they also sound a lot like the others. What makes them stand out? What makes them different?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've seen ransomware as a service operating for quite some time. That in itself isn't new. But Darkseid is very technically sound. They operate a well-tested ransomware binary itself, meaning that it's known to operate on all the different endpoints. They know that typically Linux and Windows itself, multi-platform. They have multilingual voice support for the attacker and victim to communicate. I mean, they can communicate by text as well, multilingual as well, but also by voice. I mean, it's a very sophisticated communication system, very sophisticated backup of files, very, very sophisticated encryption system in itself. They're also very, very geopolitically aware, which is something that you don't see in a lot of the other ransomware as a service systems that have existed for a number of years already. Like we talked about, they'll keep their servers in places like Iran. I mean, the phraseology that Darkseid itself uses in its advertising, if you will, is they use unrecognized republics. So they're putting them in islands off the coast of Africa, Middle East, different areas that are very difficult to get to. They're very, very well resourced. I mean, when they kicked off their campaign, so just to go back a little bit, Darkseid may have some authors, originators that share some lineage back to the REVIL group, REVIL, that exists a little while prior. And when Darkseid first launched its campaign, they deposited 20 Bitcoin, like 300 grand, in an underground holding account, just to show others that they meant business and they're not wanting to goof around a whole bunch. Darkseid claims that they're getting something on the order of $400,000 in attack. Analysis that's been done by some companies that do nothing but analyze cryptocurrency transactions says that it's much, much higher. They say that Darkseid victims are averaging somewhere on the order of 2 million per ransom, something on the order of 90 million total in Bitcoin sitting in their accounts. So I mean, it's been quite successful in that area as well.
Man, so it sounds like that 170,000 average ransomware payment from last year is going to keep going up at this rate. Adam, what does this mean from a defense perspective? You're wearing the blue shirt today. How should we treat this differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're seeing is a watershed moment right now. I think you're seeing the law enforcement starting to play their part, right? You start to see the public-private partnership actually working to actually show where certain responsibilities begin and where they end. In the shared responsibility of security, right, there's a certain group in the private sector that are going to be your sort of go-to for incident response, detection, all these types of tools that you need to monitor and defend against this kind of stuff, maybe recover quickly. Then you're going to see, obviously, public, and by that I mean government, law enforcement agencies play a role in holding these people accountable, trying to recover money, looking at the money laundering, the other aspect of this. And then, squarely on the small to medium enterprise, the people who are likely on the phone today, you really have a responsibility to configure your environment to make this a very, very difficult attack to execute quickly and thoroughly. And if you look at the playbook of a ransomware outbreak or a data loss event, especially when the goal is financial remuneration, there's a certain amount of investment that they have to make in you in order for that to pay off. And so the more you can slow them down, the more that you can configure your environment to utilize things like segmentation, things like policies around credential usage on single systems, separation of duty, which I'll get into very specifically near the end of this call, and practice incident response to shorten your recovery time, much like CP did correctly, I think, right? Proactively shutting off systems, making sure they curtailed, and obviously with their payment system taken over, they decided to pay. But the idea there is that, the playbook needs to be practiced as well. So, planning to fail and being ready to execute on those playbooks is a big thing. So, I think that the number one thing that the customer that can do on their own network, right, the business IT folk can focus on doing is slowing these attackers down, making this very difficult and challenging to hop around in the network from asset to asset, get access to data, obviously encrypt machines in the middle of the night. Because that's what's really the levers at your disposal at this point that live outside of interfacing with the enforcement agencies and interfacing with the private sector.
Yeah. Where do the wheels fall off for this attack? What's the tipping point when they really have you? I definitely want to hear from both of you, but Shawn, let's throw it back to you first.
Yeah, so because Darkseid is a long cycle attack that focuses on the double extortion, focuses on the exfiltration of files, really what's happening is they'll sit inside of your network with their finger on the trigger the entirety of the attack. So they're moving around, finding where your backup systems are, where all your source code repositories are, what kind of inter-office affairs are going on that they can grab the personal information from. And if they notice that any new security software is deployed, or a new threat hunt campaign is looking for them, or a new security service is deployed in any way, often they'll just pull the trigger right away. So the tipping point is really immediately after the attack begins, while it's still in the reconnaissance phase, way before the first encryption happens. And they're just sitting there doing their dirty work to find all of the different files that are important to them. I mean, those files that Adam mentioned, talking about playbooks and things like that, those files are likely going to include up to and including everything that's within your SOAR or orchestration infrastructure, your playbook itself. So, I mean, do you have an offline copy? Does that playbook work if an attacker knows who gets called when and how? Yeah, so I think that the tipping point is really very early in the attack cycle, shortly after exploitation, well before any files are encrypted.
Adam, do you agree with this? Where do the wheels fall off for the blue team? What's the impact here from a short and long term here? And what do folks on the phone be thinking about from preparation side?
Yeah, when you have to prepare for an event such as exfiltration of data, and assuming that they have access to information and they're now trying to solicit you to pay them for it back or to be deleted, that's a tipping point, right? Like that's a different aspect to these environments where so far we've been focused on things like backup and recovery, right? We're focused on just getting up and running and maintaining and proving to an insurance provider that we've eliminated the threat and that this is now a clean place that can operate and just keep going back to business as usual. All the while, the group saying, well, we've got your data and we're going to keep trying to embarrass you with it now until you decide to pay. And so when Shawn says the tipping point is around that initial access to your data, and when we talk about slowing people down, we want to make sure that the infrastructure is sufficiently segregated or segmented so that you have this concept of making it difficult to even try to navigate to that file, to those key systems, databases, file repositories that they would want to exfiltrate first, right? Even things like not giving them internet access from those types of systems out, like basic things that you probably have heard many times in defense in depth discussions are ways that they can kind of twist the narrative around what ransom is and how extortion works to try to hold you hostage. But even in those material damage moments, the moments where they click the finger, that nuclear, let's destroy all the systems in here, understanding just how quickly and how many systems you could access from a single one, whether that's your domain controller or your local workstation or a file server or some key, software deployment server. Those are all things, those key areas where they know how they can kind of spread out and do mass damage from that one asset you can't turn off. Those are kinds of the ways that you can sort of slow them down in those material points to be ready, because once they have control over something that's significant, your reaction time is typically less than 20 minutes, right? And that's just to contain and deal with the damage. Then you have, your offline backup recovery timeline, which, unless you've practiced restoring and you need to make maybe policy changes to thwart them from coming back, that's going to be the key time, the key material damage time that's significantly going to impact your exposure, your loss as one of these events. And frankly, knowing, quite honestly, the information at the right time, right? Like the last thing I'd say is that, the idea behind extortion, the idea behind this is that they may not, necessarily even have the data, but try to hold you, extort you anyways, right? And so the idea is that you need to have the information to know what was accessed and how it worked. So having some of that forensic data, knowing that is something that maybe an experienced incident responder is probably going to have to do for you, either ad hoc purchase at the time or hopefully during, so that you have the data before anything happens so you can explain this stuff. It's going to be key, because then you're negotiating from a position of strength or understanding how to communicate from a position of strength.
Yeah, I agree. Slowing them down is very, very important. I mean, while they're in that long cycle reconnaissance phase of the attack, they're not just looking at your network. They're attacking your network from inside the network. They're installing all kinds of weird backdoors. So at that point, what does the playbook look like? Do you pave and re-update every single endpoint that you have? Do you ship people new laptops? I mean, especially in a distributed environment, this becomes very, very expensive.
Well, speaking of expensive, Shawn, talk to us how they force you to get paid. How do they get paid? How do they force that to happen?
Yeah, so I mean, we talk about Darkseid being a double extortion ransomware system, and they certainly are. But people are starting to talk about third cycle and quadruple ransoms that are happening, whereby instead of just getting one ransom for encrypting the files and a second for exfiltrating the files and making sure that you don't leak that, and then a third one becomes, we're starting to hear stories about people getting targeted who were just customers of somebody that was a ransomware victim. So one of the cases was a mental health facility was taken over by ransomware. And not only did they have to pay the two ransoms, one for decrypting the files and one for not leaking the files, but the attackers then went after the individual patients and said, pay us a ransom or we're going to leak your mental health assessment, which of course is very, very personal. And then the fourth ransom that starts to come about is they're going back to the days of distributed denial of service, where they'll just shut down key infrastructure externally until you pay. So They have lots of ways of making sure that you pay, but part of that is understanding when and where they are in your network as to how to leverage those different payment negotiations.
Interesting. And Adam, on your side, I would say, should you pay? What happens if you do? What happens if you don't? Like, what would you recommend if this was happening to somebody on the phone?
Yeah, first off, you want to be in a position of strength, and that means having an offline copy of key data that you can restore as part of this attack, right? If the idea is that they're shutting your operation down, you need to have a thorough plan for how you're going to restore systems to full health, independent of potentially getting their keys to decrypt the information, right? And there's a lot of matrices that basically say, if there's a position you can't come back from, then that's the decision as to whether or not you should pay. And, I tend to disagree because there's many circumstances where one of your key assets is an application. And, encrypting the files, alters the permissions and you have all these other things that are at play in that complex ecosystem of relationships of files to an application that even if you were to, decrypt it in many cases, you probably aren't going to be operational with what you have back. So you're really just trying to reinstall anyway. So if you're not in one of those positions, and you've kind of not practiced the idea of recovering from offline or working on, recovery and containment where you can segregate and cut off access to key systems to make sure you have time to operate, then you're going to be in a position where, unfortunately, they may have the advantage on you. The other thing is, without sufficient information as to whether sensitive data was accessed or whether, they're still in the environment, without a blue team, sophisticated enough to answer those types of questions, again, you're not going to be in a position of strength because there's just too many likelihoods that you can't calculate. What if they have our sensitive data? You don't know. How could they potentially use this further? We're not sure how they did the first time. Are they going to come back, right? And so, making sure you're in a position of strength from the analytics that you have around the attack and the attacker, as well as making sure you're in a position of strength to restore your own systems, obviously sounds obvious maybe to people on the phone, but those are the things that prevent you having to contact and negotiate with these individuals. And the other thing is that, even when we're talking about, should you pay, you're likely going to have a number of people that are now involved from the business side that are frankly going to start entertaining these opportunities, right? They don't understand the legal ramifications of communicating with these people. They don't understand what their breach notification requirements are. All of this lives outside IT. And, squarely trying to get questions answered by the rest of the business from IT is quite difficult. So you have to have these teams ready to give you that kind of sound advice, and not necessarily give somebody the upper hand. And that's what they're used to from some of these attacks, is just having the upper hand in terms of the cost benefit analysis around paying and making sure they have no way back, which is all they're trying to do to get them to pay.
I've got two follow-up questions for you on this, Adam. First, who should be involved in those conversations? Who do you need to have on deck and ready? Who do you want to make sure you have on your side? And the second question is, what about if you do decide to pay? I know folks are doing that. What milestones or like checkpoints should you have in order to make sure you're actually going to get the results you want from handing over this money?
Yeah, certainly the teams that you want at your disposal are fast acting, incident responders who are going to have the detail about, the entry points, the access behavior, the file, the network behavior that can help you obviously contain and eradicate this. You're definitely going to want to have, either a cyber insurer that will dispatch either legal counsel or something that's going to explain the implications to either privacy regulation or breach notification regulation with your customers and contracts that is going to help you navigate the communications plan going forward. And when you think about the pressure to pay and sort of the nuance to paying, right? You have to understand what that'll get you back, right? And like I say, you may not even be able to calculate necessarily, the method, the recovery plan, right? That these, manifestos, like you showed at the top of the hour, is just, things that they try to promise you, and you're taking an attacker's word for it, which is a very difficult position to be in. Their word for it, that they'll delete data that they won't extort you for, that they will give you access to a key for a temporary period of time to show you that it can decrypt the information. But it's not like they're going to hold your hand through the entire recovery and, come on site and help you recover the data that they've stolen, right? So, you don't necessarily know that the decryption keys are going to work in every single case. You might know that they'll decrypt the data, but you're not sure that you're going to be able to reconstruct the entirety of your network from from one of these attacks, right? So you're probably still going to be in a recovery state. So I'd say that, navigating payment, navigating those discussions requires experts. They are named incident responders. Your contracts and your liability and everything else is frankly a legal conversation that you'll either have with an in-house counsel or somebody deployed as part of your cyber insurance if you don't have one, or ad hoc at the time, worst case, commissioned by you. So maybe you have somebody on retainer, maybe you go and buy services at that time. There's a lot of emergency hotlines out there, but best to be proactive, because some of the data may not exist, and therefore some of these conclusions just can't be made, except for worst case scenario, which is A.
Right. Shawn, what about you? What are your thoughts here? Are they going to follow through on what they agree to after the payment is made? What's going on your side, the red side?
Well, one thing that jumps out at me here before we get into exactly that is, from a defender standpoint, you might be able to decrypt the files, but how are you going to ensure that they are in fact identical files? So, I mean, when we go way back to things like the SolarWinds attack, that was a source code inclusion backdoor. Somebody backdoored the source code of SolarWinds. So the same thing could happen here. As you're getting your files decrypted, are you sure that source code wasn't inserted, blueprints changed, legal contracts changed prior to signing, anything like that? But going directly to the ransomware as a service side, so Darkseid and most of the RAS vendors at this point, ransomware as a service being RAS, they operate infrastructure where you get to upload a certain number of files. And sometimes these are at the attacker's choosing, so you can't just go and pick your one file that's important or whatever. And they'll confirm that that file does decrypt properly. So you're seeing the infrastructure there. And along the way, they're also proving out their infrastructure. They're showing you that they have an original copy of it. They can show you on their server that would be the leak that here's the original copy, here's the decrypted file. So there's the double extortion. And another thing they do is they'll sorry, I blanked there.
Hit the affiliate.
Yeah. So the other thing that they do is they operate a lot of business infrastructure, like Adam's mentioning, whereby they're taking a cut to make sure that the infrastructure is well advertised. I mean, they advertise themselves as a brand like any other brand. And what we're seeing here may very well be a Darkseid rebrand as opposed to the entirety of the campaign going away. And in the process, they're selling their service in affiliate programs so that the person that's actually infecting your network will pay 15% or some percent to the RAS vendor itself, to Darkseid.
It's interesting to hear about the importance of brand and reputation here. I mean, as a marketer, I understand and know the importance of that, but I would say the tie to cyber criminals is something that is new to me, but it makes sense, right? If they want to keep getting money and having those folks actually pay off, right? They've got to build that reputation up. Adam, back to you. I would say a week ago, I would have asked you the question of, can they be beat? I think given everything that's happened in the last couple of days, specifically even in the last 24 hours, I think more so is the question of what is being done to beat these guys?
Yeah, I mean, certainly red team, blue team, I would have handed it to the red team last week. The JBS, meat supply attack following that one, they hadn't fully attributed it. Now I think they're starting to get there. I think when you start to look at these attacks and you sort of follow them, even naming, right? I don't know if you've got a lot of DC Comics fans here, but you might know is the bigger, badder guy every year sort of keeps getting the bigger and more omnipotent. And let's remember that so many things that are at play here, from the public and private sort of execution of defeating these teams, is really just about a shared understanding when it comes to the small to medium enterprise, and knowing what to do to harden your systems to avoid these types of very similar tactics that change to get around your sort of off-the-shelf software, right? And that now, when we think about beating these teams, certainly those approaches beat them and beat them consistently, right? So we know what to do. Right, we are aware of how to defeat this type of threat, and we are hoping to coach the industry, policy, and you think about the government creating whole certification programs to try to get this implemented at companies. The companies have direct advice and should know what to do and follow it. The agencies, right, the private partnerships that exist in industry, they should know what to do in terms of detection and response to this type of thing. And then now you're starting to see the agencies take control, right? And you start to see the FBI recover the actual Bitcoin from the affiliate, right? From Darkseid's sort of money collection part, right? And recovering actual Bitcoin wallet keys from them to do so, which is going to be very, very fascinating. So I think that when you think about are we beating them, this is arose by another name, right? This is, while it's a bigger, badder name for a similar group, right? While their ransomware obviously has gotten better and their infiltration techniques have gotten sharper, and they've bypassed a lot of the traditional ways we've caught them in the past. They had most of their assets frozen on this, right? Their sites shut down, Bitcoin recovered, and frankly, the oil pipeline recovering quite quickly, right? Like, we not only detected it, but proactively shut down a number of systems there. And the oil shortage and everything else may be part of a larger media story that created a run on gas, but certainly when you think about the incident response aspect of this, it wasn't that bad, right? There was a good playbook, it was executed correctly, and so a lot of the teams that are responsible for what should have been done right, while everything always could be better, we're doing right, and now we're starting to see this new arm of the law actually execute on recovery and more punitive action against the actors themselves, which is really cool.
Interesting. Shawn, do you agree? I know, like Adam mentioned, we probably would have handed it to you first a couple days ago, but is there any holes in what Adam said? Let's get your take on this.
Well, look, as somebody that's been working in the computer security field for a long time, I really like what he's saying. I really like the news that's happening here. I just want to be frank. But that said, there's really two things that jump out at me here, two real big things. First of all, the attacker has every advantage in the world. It's the Queen's Guard problem, right? All of the Queen's Guards have to be right all the time, 24/7, 365. The attacker gets right once, the assassin gets right once, the Queen dies. And the exact same thing happens here. The attacker chooses what to play, when to play it, where to play it. I mean, they have everything in their arrow quiver. We're seeing a lot of things where we're starting to get the right agencies involved for sure. But the question remains if this is something that was this a jab or was this a drop kick against the attacker? We could very well see a shift in the cryptocurrencies used, or attack cycles, attack types. They might even go full nuclear with the entirety of their repository that they have already of currently infected networks. So, the fallout from here, that this game is not done for sure. And the second thing that jumps out at me is we've heard talk of Darkseid stepping away, and the branding that goes with that, and so on. And sure, they put the roughly 300K of Bitcoin into a wallet that said that they are ready to do business as Darkseid, but 300K to them is not super huge. By some estimations, they have something on the order of 90 million kind of thing. So it's a drop in the bucket to them. It's enough to show that they're serious. But if they want to set up shop under a different name, they surely can do so. So it's the right sorts of gestures and techniques that we're seeing in the Colonial Pipelines incident. It'd be nice to see if this is something that goes pervasive across all ransomware attacks. We have seen ransomware attacks being labeled by the DOJ as terrorism, but the people that have chosen to take this line of thinking for this number of years and be on the attacker side, I don't think they're really going to be fazed by being labeled as terrorists. That's kind of a formality to them that they're probably assuming that was the case for quite some time, living in these questionable countries that they're originating from, that they're operating all of their redundant servers from, and so on. It isn't like the entirety of the Darkseid network went down. And from my understanding, the main press releases here were getting the money back from the affiliates, not the ransomware as a service vendor itself.
Interesting. So I think we're going to need some practical advice for everyone on the phone. Shawn, can you give us like the three big takeaways, the 3 bullet points here? Where's Darkseid today? I think we've touched on that a lot, and I know that is literally changing by the hour. But are they sticking around? What does this look like in the coming months for everybody?
Yeah, so I think they're absolutely sticking around. People that have this skill set are not somebody that can easily just walk up to CNN or other big news outlet and say, yeah, well, I'm now clean. I'm no longer going to be infecting people, and everybody's going to trust them. They've been around doing this for quite some time. There's links to Revil, REVIL, the ransomware crew that claimed to have ceased operation into Darkseid, who now Darkseid claims to cease operation. But they're taking a lot of cash with them, a lot of resources, a lot of technology, a lot of infrastructure. I kind of doubt that the announcement that they've shut down completely is really true. I mean, some of the developments that I am probably going to be reading about in the near future is a real increase in personal blackmail. I mean, we've seen the reports of exfiltrating passports. We've seen them harvesting credentials that can go into a victim environment. The next step is more about blackmailing the whales that they find in their victim repository, any of the social interactions, Me Too type events that come out of the various ransomware compromises. I think we're going to see a lot of lateral movement moving into the home. So, I mean, we're all working from home for quite some time now, and that likely means that people's spouses are also working from home. So for an attacker to be in Corporation One's network and then move laterally within Corporation One, it's very similar to them moving to Corporation Two, the spouse's computer at home, and also into your personal photo repositories, gaming machines, whatever else you do at home. It's very similar from an attack infrastructure. And like we talked about earlier, I don't think ransomware is camping at double extortion. I mean, data encryption has been around for quite some time. It goes back to something in the order of 2006 in fairly wide scale, 89 for the farthest one, of course. But the data exfiltration is going to be much, much bigger. They're going to, with the long cycle attacks, they're just building out the infrastructure now to house really the entirety of what's important in a corporation rather than having to spend the time picking and choosing. We're going to see lots of victims, customers, and partner exploitation. So not just jumping to your spouse, but jumping to all of the supply chain items that you have, any partners you have, security vendors moving laterally there. And then seeing the distributed denial of service come back is really unfortunate. I mean, that was one that was quite difficult to contain when that was big in .com 1, and seeing that come back with all the different bot herds is unpleasant twist to the ransomware development.
The thing that stands out again here is in the marketer in me is where does a team with this skill set and infrastructure go from here? And I think that obviously ties in a lot to what you were talking about, the importance of brand and reputation to them. And my assumption is that there will be some rebranding efforts coming in the next couple of months here.
Yeah. Brand is really important. I mean, computer security is not typically taught in universities. You can get degrees in it, of course, now. But I mean, even going back to like Cult of the Dead Cow and Loft and things like that, brand is very important to attackers. But this group has shown that they're more than happy to rebrand to keep the infrastructure going.
Adam, what about you? We talked about the adversary. We didn't talk about the tech. Where does tech come in? What works and what can people be doing today from a playbook perspective? Let's give everyone on the line some practical advice here to take back.
Yeah, I think of the most underutilized tools that are the most significant when dealing with an adversary that's jumping between assets, hoping to find sensitive data, hoping to just identify things. The ways that you can make it so difficult for them, the things that are not documented very easily are things like your host firewall rules, right? You've heard of Windows firewall. You probably turn it off all the time because it just frustrates you. This is one of the key aspects of segmentation, specifically on Windows networks, that'll help people not only protect their assets at home from inbound, but also when any device is infected, not making it a vector to spread across the entirety of the network, right? And so that first network segmentation, using specifically host firewall policies that'll pervade the inside and outside and cloud and all that stuff, it'll just sort of belong to the asset, is a great place to start. Making sure that you don't have a credential, local account, whatever admin account that can go and make widespread changes, right? Restricted groups in Windows or other types of group permissions on Linux that can help you essentially make sure that any one credential doesn't have access to multiple systems to kind of build that weapon of mass destruction, that cascading effect of one credential wreaking havoc. Third, just a fundamental understanding that Google software restriction policy for Windows, I think I've been basically the biggest evangelist for this outside of Microsoft probably for the past several years. And the reason is that most people just misunderstand the permissions model on Windows and say nobody has admin rights or they don't have user rights, and they don't understand that software running has nothing to do with those rights. Software installing may have something to do with those rights when the installer is built by a trusted third-party publisher. But scripts and little EXEs and stuff that comes in your attachments from email, they're not necessarily going to follow a restriction policy, right? They can run like utilities and completely bypass your user permissions, and that can kind of leave you in a bad space. So making sure you lock that down. And then last, that having a backup is not enough. You must practice restoring from backup, and yes, I mean offline. There has to be a practice of not only three things, right? One, making sure you have a persistent online incremental backup, so you're backing up a lot. Two, that you have physically redundant places that you're backing up, right? The cloud or multiple systems, multiple pieces of hardware, so the hardware doesn't go away. And third, that you have an offline copy of that, something with the power off in a closet that you can't get to with a computer, that can bring you back from, just complete annihilation of every other asset. So when we think about these principles, they're sort of, in my mind, despite a number of frameworks and a number of guidance principles here, these are the most practical things that an SME, small to medium enterprise, can use to do their stuff, to prepare themselves in a defensive position against an adversary like this and an attack like this.
Interesting. Here we go. Thanks, Adam and Shawn. I hope that gives everyone a little bit more insight into how they can practically be thinking about this in the day-to-day. I know we only have an hour, and this is a days-long conversation, but I wanted to thank you guys for diving into this today. I know we've all heard and read about Darkseid recently, even more so probably in the last 24 hours, but I think it's really interesting just to take a step back and look at it from both sides of things, the attacker and the defender side, and then how it actually all relates to what we're all doing on a day-to-day basis at our organization. So I appreciate you both taking the time. For everyone on the line, we know this conversation obviously does not end here for you. As you think about taking back what you've heard today from both Shawn and Adam, we're going to open it up for questions in a minute. So if you do have any, make sure you get them into the questions field on the right-hand side. But I wanted to also provide you guys with a few additional resources that you can use to dive into the various topics that we covered today. So first, we have a white paper focused on the rise of ransomware as a service. In this, you can get a deep dive on the development of ransomware, the history of it, the tactics across the attack lifecycle, specifically with how that pertains to your organization. Second, we have an incident response plan, which includes a list of basic detection and response actions that your IT teams can follow as they respond and remediate incidents. And then last but not least, we have a white paper on testing and validating the maturity of your cybersecurity programs. In the white paper, we dive into help you understand how to harden your systems without the need for additional services and tools. Great resources here. You can find these in the attachment tab below the presenter screen. Alternatively, if you want to speak with anybody on the line here in more depth, or anyone else here at Act Zero, you can book some time. Again, at our attachments, there is a link to that, or on our website through our contact us page. And with that, let's open it up to some questions. All right, what do we have here? So we have one. We've got some more coming in here. What are the most common ways these bad actors gain access to your systems in the first place? Phishing, etc. Adam, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, look, I get this question a lot, right? And the single vector thinking, right? Like, how are they going to get in? Let's reinforce that front door and just try to block them out. And here's the thing. Over the course of the year, I've seen 3 extremely significant vectors that would have allowed attackers like this to completely compromise your systems without credentials, right? If you use the stats-driven answer and we go to like the Verizon breach report or some other study of breaches that say, well, they harvest credentials all the time, and business email compromise or phishing attacks are a very common vector to start these attacks with, attachments that turn into scripts, that turn into bots, that turn into lateral movement, and then, boom. But let's not forget that throughout the year, we've had things like the on-premise Exchange Hafnium exploit, which allowed complete control of your Exchange server with no credentials from the internet, using a 0-day that was around for weeks. There was tens of thousands of machines that had, executed this compromise, and the FBI had to go and patch them secretly, right? There was the SolarWinds attack, right, which again was a compromised, supply chain attack of software that, again, many agencies, including very secure ones, had had another entry point into the organization. So, what's common and what did they use is not as significant a question as the understanding that they change tactics constantly. And that those 3 or 4 things that I just mentioned, stealing your credentials from a LinkedIn compromise and making you change your passwords or turn on MFA, the business email compromise and setting up anti-phishing or a policy to detect things in Office 365, that Hafnium exercise, which is, how are you going to detect that, right? Agents and backtracking EDR. What is your position, right? You start to see this almost like 1,000 options problem. It's like going to an ice cream store with too many toppings and you're just crippled by choices. I think that you have an issue in trying to navigate your security program simply based on entry point. Just basically trying to say, well, let's just shut them out. There's going to be one way that they're going to keep coming in. Let's keep them out like this is our house, and they'll never get far enough to cause a problem. We have to anticipate the knowns, right? So we know about business email compromise. We know about things like botnets. Those are knowns. We have known unknowns, right? We have the concept of being able to track and look for suspicious scripting and everything else using machine learning, using advanced endpoint, advanced network and logging technology, right? Advanced technologies. And then you have the unknown unknowns. Nobody, including Microsoft, knew about the Exchange attack until it was publicly disclosed by another third party, right? And so, that's where things like threat hunting and looking for indicators of attack and monitoring for things that we have no idea of what's going on, are going to participate in understanding your attack surface. But just to pivot from one recon attempt or weaponization attempt to the other is going to be the tail wagging the dog, because then you're only protecting what happened and not what's coming up, right? Which is a dangerous position to follow from past data only. So it's a vector of all 3 of those scenarios. It constantly changes, and you need a team and a SOC that adapts to that.
Thanks, Adam. One thing before we have a couple more questions, but for everyone on the line, before you hop off at the end today, if you can provide us with a rating, this is found under the presenter screen beside the attachment tab. We definitely want to hear your feedback here. Make sure that, if this was valuable, if you want to see more like this in the future, so that we can plan and make sure we're delivering what you guys want to hear. Next question. This one is, I believe, for you, Shawn. When you crack open a variant executable, how do you actually determine where the attacker comes from?
Yeah, clever question. Clever question. So, I mean, for a long time, this was done manually. Way back in the day, this was like a new strain would come in and I'd start reverse engineering with IDA or something like that. And I'd recognize that there were parameters in it that were cloned from something else I looked at. And then I would say this is from a variant of X. So, I mean, that was super, super primitive. But 2 big developments have happened in the last, let's say, decade that I've experimented with. One is a gene-based approach, and the second is a graph-based approach. So with the gene-based approach, it's similar to many other types of machine learning, where you extract a set of features of the malware that you feed into your machine learning algorithm. But along the way, you include, I don't know if it's the correct terminology, but I call them genes. So these are items that are specific to a given family of malware that would be used as a feature in itself. But this would be things like, perhaps it's your function naming, or a section where one function calls another, or it's a programming nuance of the author, whereby they're basically showing how they like to do things in the code and how they like to optimize algorithms. And the second approach, which I had better luck with, is a call graph approach, where you look at function 1 calls function 2, calls function 3, and you end up with this big pyramid or big graph of all the different functionality within a given piece of source. So the end result there is you can do graphical analysis where it's a machine learning again, where you're comparing all your samples with the new sample, and out comes the closest match with various clustering techniques. And I mean, both of these techniques have different benefits and weaknesses, but ultimately they do a really, really good job at automating what used to be a very unscientific and entirely manual operation. So the end result is that you have a pure technical breakdown of like sample X shares coding similarities with sample Y, but you still know nothing at all about why that is. I mean, sometimes bad actors will go and steal code from another bad actor, or sometimes they'll just have like friendship or business disputes and they'll rip off parts of the source code, or maybe they purchased or licensed part of the source code from each other, and bad actors will swipe code from each other. But interestingly, you'll see good actors doing the exact same thing. One example of this is in his book, Playing to the Edge, former NSA and CIA director Michael Hayden talks about how they would repurpose off-the-shelf malware for the tasks that they needed. So that here, I mean, it just shows that the attribution of why something is similar is very, very hard. You can tell that it's similar, but answering that why question, what actors were behind making it similar, is very, very hard.
Thanks. The next one I'm going to put to you, Adam. How can they keep getting away with this legally?
Yeah, let's not, pretend that just because they're, committing a computer crime and they're doing it in a different country, that they're not breaking a lot of laws, both domestically in whatever country they're in, and in places where there's probably not a lot of extraterritorial relationships for the law to come and get them. When you think about let's just work on the money aspect of this. So like when you think about the money kind of flowing through, right? You execute whatever it is, computer crime, right? You ask the victim for remuneration, you ask them for Bitcoin payment. That Bitcoin, obviously, depending on how much people on the phone know about Bitcoin, goes into a transaction system where you have an account name and you have obviously the number of Bitcoin that changed hands, right? There's copies of a ledger that make sure that you don't copy and paste more money into the system, and that ledger tracks that account and all the changes of that Bitcoin supply in an exchange, right? So while everybody thinks of Bitcoin and other, cryptocurrencies as this decentralized, impossible to trace area, there is a ledger about the transactions, right? And while it may be confusing to play the kind of three-card Monty on where the money went, there's also typically an exchange, like Bitcoin themselves, who might track things like IP addresses or other types of things to that. Now, that's all well and good to kind of try to hide anonymously the money that's being transferred for illegal and now acts of terrorism, right? Illegal activity. So you're financing terrorism through these things. And then on the other end, you have to change it, right? You have to exchange this for goods, services, other things. We kind of joke around at the threat hunters about, the price of coffee, meaning what, the price of drugs might be, because they just change the currency to something else that's not, binary. But in this case, when you change it over to cash, right, that's specifically where you start to trigger the traditional traps of money laundering, right, where you're ordering money mules to go and get travelers' checks or something and deposit them into account. So there's a couple of different ways that people don't get away with this, right? And while you read a lot of articles about how the FBI maybe tried to did get the money back from potentially the affiliate of Darkseid that was probably doing that money muling part of the transaction, they needed to get access to the wallet, right? They needed to get into that crypto wallet in order to get the money back from these people. So how did they do that, right? And so in order to keep them from getting away with it, we all have a responsibility beforehand, left of boom, do the hardening, do the monitoring, keep them out, make sure they're not going to be successful. And then on the other side, law enforcement has to find ways to deconstruct either the ledger to find out where these accounts are going, right? And then hopefully on the other end, at the money laundering end, right, trying to get the money out from their illegal activities with a bank or a cash deposit or something, they have traditional monitoring methods and this kind of jurisdictional thing to try to get them on the other side. So I would say that they usually get away with it. In a lot of money laundering cases, they get away with it because the transaction size is too low, right? They just don't have the same sort of monitoring for it. But when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars per hit, a single activity that is really, really high, you're now going to start to attract enforcement agencies that are well more empowered to kind of deconstruct the ledger, set up the money laundering traps on the other side, find you, squeeze you for that Bitcoin wallet amount, very likely, and then getting the data back. And again, we don't have full attribution as to how they got the private keys in the wallet. That's still kind of a fun inside baseball, how'd the FBI get the key? But they could get it in any number of ways, right? Squeeze it out of the person by finding the money laundering transaction on one side, some cool as of yet unknown vulnerability in the cryptocurrency exchange that they have. They could circumvent that key or hack their computer to get the key out of that. So there could be a lot of different ways they did it, but the work was hard. Hats off to the FBI for doing it. And getting this far this fast. But that's how they typically get away with it. It's either, lost in the anonymity of Bitcoin and the jurisdiction of, global politics of enforcement, or the transaction is low on the money laundering side that nobody really notices what's going on. But the second you try to go whale hunting and get millions of dollars and shut down a pipeline, you're not going to get away with that act of terror before you start introducing very sophisticated areas of law enforcement who are going to come and get you.
Right. We probably have time for one more. Shawn, we'll start with you. Adam, I'd like to get your input on this one as well, but how are today's MDRs helping with actors inside your network?
Yeah. So one of the core tenets of MDR, Managed Detection Response offering, is a threat hunting service. And at its core, threat hunting is looking for things that automated detection and protection systems can't. So like we talked about with all these long cycle attacks and the attackers sitting with their finger on the trigger, ready to go nuclear and encrypt at a moment's notice if need be. It's really important to have a set of threat hunters that are diligently looking at your network without installing new sensors. They're looking at existing logs. They're also factoring in that those logs may themselves have been altered, and they're looking for times when those logs have been altered. And along the way, they're trying to assess where exactly the actor is in the network, where they've been, and how close they are to being able to go nuclear and encrypt all the files or cause other havoc internally. They need to be able to understand if a data exfiltration has taken place and any of the other elements that occur within an attack cycle.
Thanks, everyone. That's all the time we have. Would love to be able to get to some more questions here, but we're right at the hour. If we didn't get to your questions, we will reach out directly with those answers. Please remember to provide your feedback and rating at the end so that we can make sure that we are delivering what you guys want and you're joining for. Also, you can find the additional resources that we spoke to in the attachments tab just below. Again, thank you to both of our speakers and everyone on the line for taking the time to hear what they had to say today. We hope that you'll join us again soon. Bye-bye.